So I think there's three themes that we're telling our clients to watch out for. The first is geopolitics. And the reason why this is so important is for everything else President Trump says tonight, there's a process. We can work the process and there's time to respond. But for geopolitics, that can change in an instant. So obviously keep an eye on what he says there. The other is tariffs. He's going to double down on tariffs. I don't think you're going to see any new information coming out from tariffs, but he's going to double down and he's going to have to look the Supreme Court in the eye and say, why did you essentially reverse my IEEPA tariffs? But when it comes to affordability, we're seeing a lot of headline risks and opportunities. We don't anticipate a lot of new ideas. Potentially, President Trump's talking about this idea of a new 401k for, Americans that don't have employer-sponsored programs. But the thing about headline risk is that for anything that President Trump says, like cutting credit card interest rate caps, interest at 10%, requires an act of legislation. It's going to be very difficult to get through in an election year.
I have been saying, folks, really off the mic, to be honest, where is the military in the discussion of Iran? And there it is, Nathan Dean, those photographs on the cover of the Washington Post, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the reporting is they're saying slow down. Into this State of the Union tonight, how will the president address the military in preparations in the Middle East?
So it really comes down to the fact that, are we going to see what Bloomberg News is reporting of this limited strike, or are we going to see negotiations take place on Thursday? I mean, that's really, I think, the signal that we're looking for. We're seeing a lot of what Bloomberg Economics is putting out on the subject, and they've just been saying that, like, look, we've got a significant number of assets in the region, and they can't stay there forever. So, we're going to look for words that essentially says, are we going to offer the olive branch, or are we going to try and drive this, more of a force, if you will, to bring people to the table. But again, this idea of limited strike is really what's the idea that's floating around Washington at the moment.
Nathan, it is an election year. How typically do presidents use this State of the Union address during an election year, particularly when President Trump's approval ratings are lower? The Republicans in the ranks are a little bit concerned about some of those trends.
Great question. State of the Unions during election years are always campaign speeches, and that's what people should be thinking of when they watch tonight. President Trump isn't going to move to the middle. He's going to try and drive a little bit deeper in terms of bringing back, optimism, if you will, amongst the Republican Party. Because if you look at the prediction markets, the odds are favoring that the Democrats are going to take the House, and they have a little bit stronger opportunity of taking the Senate. So I think you're going to see President Trump come back to Republican ideas to try and drive optimism amongst the party. You're not going to see Democrats really, stand up and clap for the president all that much. It's going to be very much a partisan speech, and that's something that we should take in mind when he says statements like, I want to do this. Can you get that through an election year? In a lot of cases, presidents can't do that.
Is there pushback, or I guess the question is, what level of pushback is there in D.C. amongst the folks down there about this whole tariff policy? It doesn't seem to be polling particularly well, yet the president is very adamant about doubling down, tripling down.
So it's not really there's much pushback in the way of just there's uneasiness. And the way that the Republicans are approaching this is they're essentially saying, look, I just would prefer to talk about something else, because even though you have the Republicans who are signaling that they're uneasy about tariffs, they're not going to push back on the president, certainly during an election year when they need his support in the primary season. So, maybe after the primary season, think May, you could see additional pushback. But right now, the Republicans are just going to say hands off. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think a reconciliation bill can get forward. So when you hear senators say, I want to codify President Trump's tariffs, it's just probably not going to happen.
Nathan, you are more qualified than anyone at Bloomberg to talk about this. When you go north from Harry's Chocolate Shop at Purdue, boiler up, Nathan Dean, and you go up and you go across the width of Illinois, and all of a sudden there's a river and there's Davenport. The president has to speak tonight to Marionette Miller Meeks, of the 1st District in Iowa. She's fighting for her life. What does President Trump have to say to Congresswoman Miller Meeks of Davenport?
It has to be about affordability and affordability and affordability. And this is one of the problems for the Republican Party at the moment, because you're going to hear President Trump talk about significant number of ways to cut down costs for consumer goods. But in the same breath, he's embracing tariffs, which we would argue has an inflationary impact as well. And so this is really a muddled message. But President Trump has to essentially tell the American people that he understands that costs are going up. And when his message is essentially said, we're bringing costs down and inflation is down, it's a difficult message for a lot of people to gather.